Hey, AP World, let me know when you show up. I am ready to go to review Unit 6, and we'll get started here as soon as everybody starts coming into the live. Welcome, welcome. I'm ready to review Unit 6 with you guys. Super excited we don't have school tomorrow. Who's excited about that? Drop a comment over there and let me know if you're excited about that. So this test will be on Monday instead of tomorrow because we're not going to be in school tomorrow. So that means you have extra time to study. All right. So drop a comment over there. Let me know when you are here. And we're going to get started on 6.1. which is rationales for imperialism from 1750 to 1900. So I want to get started quickly here in just a second. And since you do not have school tomorrow, we will move the test to Monday. So you have extra time now to study. Awesome. All right, well, welcome in. Drop a comment over there. Let me know who's here. Good to see you guys tonight. Once again, since we don't have school tomorrow, we will move the test till Monday. So you'll have a little bit extra time to study the information that we go over tonight, which is good news. Real quick, I was grading some LEQs today. Hey, guys, welcome. And I just wanted to share with you guys a couple of quick tips that I saw happen a lot on the LEQs while we're waiting for people to show up. So context, a lot of people miss the context because they didn't tie it to the prompt. There was one prompt about the shift of power and what causes that and like the changes that go along with that. And a lot of the contexts were great, but you have to tie it in with that prompt and somehow talk about how the context leads to the shift in power. So for example, the context on some of the LEQs that you guys wrote was about imperialism and how imperialism leads up to this shift in power in the 1750 to 1900 timeframe. So connect that to it and say, imperialism leads to the shift of power because it gives Europeans the advantage in order for them to take over in other places. All right. That simple sentence gets you that context point. You have to add it in with the prompt. Okay, so welcome. Yes, Sam, we don't have school tomorrow. Isn't that exciting? Yes, because of the water thing. That's right. So your test will be moved to Monday. And Dominique, I was just talking about the LEQ context because I was grading some of those today. And several of the ones that I graded didn't get the context point because they didn't tie it in with the prompt. So make sure that you do that. Okay, let's get started on your review for Unit 6. Now that you don't have this test until Monday, you guys have extra time to study this. So I expect you to make some note cards or at least review this quite a bit so that you're ready to go on Monday. All right, so we're going to start with 6.1. And 6.1 is rationales for imperialism. So basically, how did they justify imperialism? And the first thing that it talks about is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism, super easy theory, right? If you know the Darwin's theory about evolution, the survival of the fittest, it was a biological selection type thing that was based on science. They basically took his theory and they made it into a social theory. And they said that only the strong survive and the weak will be weeded out. So they basically said that because of social Darwinism, they had the right to be able to go in and take over these other countries. Writers and politicians will use this in order to justify imperialism. Sam says this unit is mainly new revolutions and imperialism, right? I wouldn't really call them revolutions. You're going to want to call them rebellions because they're different than the revolutions in that they're not technically revolutions. They're categorized more as rebellions. And yes, it's primarily about imperialism and the effects of imperialism. Okay, so rationales you can also put in there and remind yourself of the white man's burden. Remember, we read that poem, and that is a part of rationale too. It's kind of their Christian duty to go and help the natives and improve their lives. All right. Okay, let's go to 6.2. So 6.2 was state expansion and state building and formation, declining. All right, all of those things put together. And on your study sheet, you had a little chart that had the different places. So let's talk about Congo first. Congo, King Leopold of Belgium is going to go into the Congo, and it's going to eventually shift to the government. The reason is because of his abuse of power. That happens in 1908, where the parliament take that power away from him. And basically the cause of the shift is the abuse of the king upon the natives. Remember, he pretty much rules with an iron fist. He goes in there and he enslaves them, basically. They don't call it slavery, but that's basically what it is. And he tortures and kills, and it's just awful. Definitely works them to death in the Congo. And if you have read The Ghost of King Leopold or an excerpt of that, you've gotten a little taste of what that was like. And that's why Parliament takes that power away. All right, let's move on to Indonesia and South Asia. That's where we have the Dutch East India Company, not Dutch. Dutch East India Company, all right. And this is the Dutch government is eventually going to take them over, so the power will shift to the Dutch government. And the reason is because the Dutch East India Company is basically abusing the power by making treaties they're not supposed to and maintaining an armed force, and also corruption. All right, so that's some of the reasons why that's taken away. Then we're going to go to India. India's previous owner were the French. Then it shifts to the British. French lost India during the 7 Years' War. Remember, the 7 Years' War was the same one that they're going to fight in the Americas, called the French and Indian War. Same one, all right? They're fighting in two different places. Yeah, I'm so excited. No school tomorrow. Guys, trust me when I say I love coming to school and seeing you all, but this has been such a long week. I'm so tired. And I'm starting to get sick. And so I'm like, when I found out that we didn't have school tomorrow, I was like, yes, I get to sleep in, but I will miss you all for sure. So I'll see you on Monday though. And guess what, Wayne? More time for you to study now. So that worked out well for you guys. All right. So then we have on the study sheet, European and states, as well as the U.S. and Japan, acquired territories throughout Asia and the Pacific, while Spanish and Portuguese influences decline. So remember that LEQ prompt that you may have gotten if you were in this class about the shift in power? That would have been a good time to talk about that. There's a definite shift in power. U.S., Japan, they're going to acquire more, whereas the Spanish and Portuguese, they start declining in power. Okay, let's go on to the second chart that you have. So we're talking about the European state, Great Britain, and the areas that they control. The first one is West Africa. So let's talk about West Africa. Okay, so in Africa, and this would be more of east, well, kind of like northeast, they build the Suez Canal, and this is in Egypt, and they force workers to work without pay as a form of taxation. So you're going to want to put that down. So if this is Africa, oh, that's a really bad Africa. Hold on. There's the little horn of Africa. And here's the Middle East. And down here would be India. Okay, Suez Canal is going to be, here's the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. And it's going to be right here so that they can now go through here instead of having to go all the way around Africa. So that was important that they controlled that, because they would hold the power to that area. All right. Then they're also going to spread Western education, the English language, and Christianity to their colonies. Specifically in Sierra Leone and Gambia. This is how you spell Sierra Leone. And Gambia. In those two places, these were colonies that were made for former slaves throughout the British Empire. So they're now freed, and they would immigrate to these places in order to live out the rest of their life from being enslaved. Okay, so they're no longer enslaved, they're free. It is also used for a home base to stop the exportation of slaves from that region. All right, then they also have Lagos or Lagos. I think it's Lagos. It's spelled like that. And this serves as a base to annex what is now Nigeria. Parts of Ghana also will become a colony. And the Ashanti Empire, that one stays independent. And that's spelled, I think there's an H. Yeah, Ashanti. Ashanti Empire stays independent. So remember that. I'm sorry, I'm like all sniffly and nasally tonight. My allergies are just kicking my butt right now. All right, so also for Britain, they used both diplomacy and warfare to expand their empire. Remember, they have better technology than a lot of the tribes. Some of the tribes will have actual guns and weaponry, but the British have better guns and better technology. They made treaties. That's the diplomacy part. So they will make some treaties with African kings, but eventually these treaties will be meaningless because of the European competition to come in and take over Africa. And African resistance definitely happens, but it's going to be something that will be put down by military force. For example, the Zulus and several other tribes, but the Zulus are the ones that we talk about. They definitely are shut down with force and not allowed to progress. All right, so the test, Rami, will be on Monday since we don't have school tomorrow, just to answer your question. All right, let's talk about Britain and India next. Get a clean board here. Okay, so Britain and India. So from the 12th century onward, that's when the Muslims were in India. They ruled the area, and many Hindus felt suppressed by them. Remember, Muslims and Hindus do not get along. There are several differences between their religion. For example, they serve different gods. They believe in different doctrines. The Hindus think that the cow is sacred, and the Muslims don't eat pork. So they have several differences, right? And the Muslims are very oppressive to the Hindus, or at least in the Hindus' point of view, that's how they feel. And so India is very, very disunified or ununified. They are not together at all. And at first, when the British come in, most high up in the Hindu religion, like the Hindu scholars, they really, really think that the British are good for coming in. That it's almost like their God has sent them the British in order to get rid of the Muslims. All right. So at first, the British are very well liked for that reason. Okay. However, this opinion starts to change because of the Sepoy Rebellion. Sepoy Rebellion is the first time that we are going to see unification between the Muslims and the Hindus and the start of Indian nationalism. Yes, test will be on Monday. Okay, so remember that before this time frame, before the Sepoy Rebellion, not unified. They don't get along. And then the Sepoy Rebellion unifies them. Remember, the Sepoy Rebellion was because the cartridges that they got their gunpowder in were greased with cow fat and pig fat. And Muslims and Hindus could not tolerate that because they had to rip the top of it off with their mouth, and they were afraid that they were going to get that in their mouth. And remember, Muslims don't eat pork, and Hindus, the cow is sacred. So that was a problem for them. They unified to fight the British. The British will beat them in the Sepoy Rebellion. However, it's the first time that Indian nationalism really starts to happen. Okay? So they are, Samuel, the Sepoy are like soldiers. They were hired by the British. Muslims and Hindus hired by the British. And I think it's Sepoy. It might be Sepoy, but either way, close enough on the pronunciation. Okay, let's look at Belgium and in the Congo. We already kind of talked about this a little bit. Just remember that under King Leopold, the Congolese were serving as ivory hunters and porters. porters were carriers of big, heavy loads. They would often carry these loads into the jungle, very, very far distances. All right. Oftentimes they would die while doing it because it was such hard work. And so it was just a very bad, harsh treatment under King Leopold's command in the Congo. And then French West Africa, that is in Algeria, it's going to become a settler colony. So settlers from France will actually go there. Guinea, the Ivory Coast, and Niger are trading posts. So make sure that you put that down. The Ivory Coast and Guinea and Nigeria. These will be trading posts for the French, or controlled by the French. And they will use a system of direct rule where Africans are not considered citizens, but instead they're considered subjects of the French government. Okay? That's another thing that you guys should probably note. There was an LAQ question about similarities and differences between Africa and East Asia and how they were imperialized. Remember, Africa is imperialized differently. Africa, they go in and they're direct ruling it. They're taking over military, political, kicking out the tribal leaders for the most part that were already there. Okay, sometimes there's some treaties, but like I said before, those are usually ending up worthless. In China, though, they go in and it's more of a sphere of influence. They don't completely kick out the government. Remember, they let the dynasty stay after the Opium Wars, and they're just controlling little areas economically. All right, so that's a difference. The review is probably on the hub. Yes, Dominique. But if not, you can just take notes and follow along. Okay, let's look at European countries. What countries did they establish settler colonies in? Okay, so we've got Britain. They established settler colonies in Africa. However, they weren't super successful in getting further up towards the equator in Africa. And the reason is because the germs worked against them this time. Remember when they went to the Americas and the germs worked for them and killed the Native Americans? In Africa, it was the opposite. It was so hot. They weren't used to malaria. Their crops and animals did not do as well up closer to the equator. So that's why a lot of the settler colonies are down close to South Africa. Also in Australia, we see some settlements, and this is mostly in the form of a penal colony where prisoners are sent. So this would be in Australia, and Britain is making that. And then we also have some colonies in New Zealand as well. For France, they have settler colonies in Africa, the Caribbean islands, as well as South America. Okay. So remember, during the imperialism time, it's not as much about sending settlers as it is getting the raw materials. That's more important. But they do send settlers, and we do have migration, which we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, so let's look at topic 6.3, indigenous responses to state expansion. Then it goes to increasing questions about political authority, growing nationalism. Let's talk real quick the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Okay, patriotism and nationalism very similar in that they both are a loyalty to your country, a love for your country, but nationalism kind of takes it a step further and gives you pride in your culture as well, and kind of like really makes people unify under that culture. All right. And then if you have extreme nationalism, you can go as well and kind of like really makes people unify under that culture. All right. And then if you have extreme nationalism, you can go to that. We'll talk about that extreme nationalism. Okay. Causes of the Boxer Rebellion. That's in your chart there. So it says the Chinese hatred of foreigners are a result of the Opium Wars. Remember, the Opium Wars happened from 1839 to 1890. And that's when the Chinese are kind of like, we don't really like the foreigners. They're kind of ruining our culture. They're coming in, taking over economically, and we don't like that, right? So then, as a result of that, due to this hatred, anti-imperialists come, and they are called the Boxers. The reason they're called the Boxers is because of their militaristic ways in fighting. They start attacking Chinese Christians and foreigners, and the Empress at that time promotes this. She actually orders that all foreigners be killed because she was very against having foreigners in there as well. The Empress and the Boxers are defeated and humiliated, and this would reduce the dynasty's legitimacy. So it's going to start to crack away at the power of that dynasty and really start to weaken the dynasty. Okay, remember the LEQ one about the shifts in power? If you got that prompt, this would definitely be a shift in power. Prior to the British coming in, the dynasty was pretty strong. But now the British are in there and they're kind of chipping away at that power and the faith that people have in that dynasty. All right. So we have anti-imperial direct resistance first. So the first one was Tupac, and that was a rebellion in Peru. Okay. Tupac, he is a descendant of the last Indian ruler. So this could go under causes. All right. Here's some causes. He is arrested and executed by the colonial administrator in 1780. Basically, he is going against the administrator's cruel punishments. He doesn't like it, so that's why he starts his rebellion. However, so sorry. When he's arrested and executed, that rebellion goes away. This revolt was against Spain, all right? It spread, before he was executed, it spread to Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina. So it was pretty successful at first until he got arrested and executed. It, of course, ends with his capture in 1781, and his family and himself are both executed. He actually has to watch his family get executed first. That's how cruel they were to him, and then they execute him. So it's not a good ending for him. All right, then we have the Touaregs military battles in West Africa, and Samori Touré is a chieftain of the Mande. I think it's Mande. That's how you spell it. And he leads warriors to establish a kingdom in Guinea. He opposed the French annexing West Africa, and he starts fighting them in 1883. At first, the French are very supportive of his expansion. However, he's unsuccessful in the expansion and unsuccessful in gaining the Ivory Coast. So the French capture him and exile him in 1898. So at first, he's kind of working with the French, and as long as he's successful in doing what the French want him to do, then things are good. And then as soon as it's not, the French get rid of him. All right, the next one is the Santewha War in West Africa. This begins in 1823. So just to give you a little bit of time frame, 1823, the British tried to subdue the Ashanti Empire. This was the fifth war, okay? There were several wars prior to this, 4 wars to be exact. This one is the fifth war, and it's led by the queen. She's a mighty warrior queen. I mean, that's pretty cool. We love our mighty warrior queens, right? The British won this war, and the death toll was super high. Ashanti becomes part of the Gold Coast colony under the British control. So it's going to be independent up until that point of that war. All right, and then we have the 1857 rebellion in India. Right beside that, the Sepoy Rebellion. It's the same thing, okay? And once you get confused, it's the same one. So it's also known as the Sepoy Rebellion. It's caused by the British using rifle cartridges that are greased with cow and pig fat. Remember, we talked about earlier in this video that the Muslims do not eat pork, and the Hindus think that the cow is sacred, so that was a problem for them. The British will shut down this rebellion. That's your outcome. However, it does mark the beginning of Indian nationalism, so that's important. All right, everybody keeping up? I hope so. I'm going to take a real quick drink of water here. I'm hoping that I'm not going to get full on sick because it's really annoying. All right, so let's talk about the Balkans. So the Balkans area, that would be in the Ottoman Empire area, And nationalism is going to start to spread there. And people are going to start to think, hey, maybe we should be independent of the Ottoman Empire. Now, around this same time, there's something going on called Turkification. This is how you spell it, Turkification. And we haven't talked about this yet. This is actually in Unit 7. However, this is when some people called the Young Turks are going to come forward, and they want the whole empire to be Turkish and to kind of fall under that culture. That's going to cause a problem for other smaller cultures because they don't want to give up their culture. And nationalism spreads even more during that time, all right? So what results is that Serbia is established. Here's how you spell Serbia. In 1815, they will get their freedom. Greece gets their freedom as well. Let me check the date on that, 1832. Bulgaria, Romania, and Montenegro will be freed in 1878 after the Russo-Turkish War. All right? So Bulgaria and Romania and Montenegro. They're freed after the Russo-Turkish War in 1878. These would have all been places that would have been in the Ottoman Empire prior to that. Bosnia-Herzegovina is put under the control of Austria-Hungary. Bosnia, I want to make sure and spell Herzegovina right, because it's quite the word. They are going to go under the control of Austria-Hungary. This will become important when we talk about World War I, especially this region right here, as well as Serbia. All right, I'm not going to give too much away because you got to have that in World War I. But ethnic tensions are definitely going to be a root cause of World War I. So how are these all established? Well, what happens is we have nationalism emerging due to the influence, first off, by the French Revolution, and then the people of the Balkans decide that they want independence too, based around the fact that they have their own cultures. And eventually, these growing tensions in this area will be one of the reasons that lead to World War I. So that's the Balkans. Let's look at the Sokoto, I think it's Sokoto Caliphate in Nigeria. This is led by a guy named Usman. I'll put it up here for you so that you know how to spell it. He leads a Muslim group of intellectuals. Basically, they want to purify the Islamic tribes, and they want to purify Islam within their tribe, and it's the Xhosa tribes. Okay, they want to make sure that Islam is purified within those tribes. So they form a caliphate, the Sokoto Caliphate. Okay. They decide to establish the slave trade in order to have economic growth within their tribe. This would be under established. However, at this time, the British are ending the slave trade and trying to fight against it continuing. So the British will actually capture some of their ships, free the slaves, and relocate them to their settler colony in Sierra Leone that was for freed slaves. The Sokoto Caliphate was then taken over by the British, and it will eventually be made part of Nigeria. So it doesn't end well for them. They're not able to stay independent. Any questions that you've got so far, just drop them over there and let me know. All right, let's go on to the Cherokee Nation. So the Cherokee were Native Americans that lived in North Carolina. After the 1800s, they assimilated with Western culture. So make sure you put this word down. Assimilated means basically they become like that culture. All right, so they're going to basically give up their culture and do what the white people in the area were doing, adopting the same methods of farming, weaving, building, dressing, everything just like what the white people are doing. They even come up with their own alphabet for the Cherokee language, which they hadn't had before, and they learned to read and write it. So basically, in the eyes of the white people, they were doing everything that they possibly could in order to be able to stay on their land in North Carolina. The problem was that gold was discovered in North Carolina in 1829. Once that was discovered, of course, white settlers wanted that land even more. And this was a problem. So Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And basically, the Indian Removal Act said that it would be safer and better for the Cherokee if they were moved off of their land and moved out to Oklahoma. Better and safer. That's kind of how the president justified it. The president at the time was Andrew Jackson. So justification was used in order to get them off their land. And they basically did not give them much time. They just told them, hey, you guys are going, pack a wagon, let's go. If they even gave them time to pack a wagon, some did not have that much time. And they were sent on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. So this is a very dark spot on American history, U.S. history in general. Okay, Dominique King Leopold of Belgium, and then it gets taken over by his government. Okay, Zulu Nation. Let's go on to the Zulu Nation. So in the 1870s, that's when the British fought the Zulus. So this is when it would be established. It's located in South Africa. They are a very well organized, centralized state. At first, the Zulus were winning, but then the British defeated them and basically took their land. And the biggest reason why the British were able to defeat them is because they had more advanced weaponry. Okay. So the next thing that we're talking about was the influence of religious ideas on these rebellions. We have three very specific topics. The first one is the ghost dance in the U.S. Basically, this started in the in the Northwest U.S. in 1869. So this would be with the Northwest Indians there. And it was basically prophet dreamers declared that the dead would drive out the whites. And the ghost dance was this ritual dance that was used in hope of speeding that along and getting the white people out of there. It eventually is going to spread to Sierra Nevada, towards the Missouri River, into Texas, as well as upwards into Canada. Eventually, it gets to the Sioux Native Americans in 1890. During the Sioux revolt, the warriors would wear what was called ghost shirts as they would do these ritual dances. And eventually, it's going to spread to Wounded Knee. In 1890, however, was the Wounded Knee Massacre. And this started because the U.S. Army went to Wounded Knee area to try and disarm the Sioux that lived there in Camp Lakota. And no one really knows exactly how it started. They think that there was a Sioux Native American who refused to give up his gun and that him and the soldier kind of got in a fight about it. But however it started, shots rang out and it ended with several women and children mostly and older people being massacred there because they didn't have weapons in order to fight. Remember, they were being disarmed at the time. And as I said, most were women and children who were killed. Some were unarmed warriors. This was the end of the Indian rebellions. And it was also thought that the ghost dance was being performed at the same time, and that could have been what scared the U.S. Army into starting to shoot. So that's how the ghost dance kind of comes into play. All right, the next one is the Xhosa, I think it's Xhosa, cattle killing, and that was in southern Africa. The British are trying to move in and rule in that area. All right, this would be from 1811 to 1858. So make sure you get that information down. And basically, they fought against the British coming in. But by 1857, their cattle was starting to die from diseases. Many think that it was probably diseases that the British had brought in. And because their cattle was dying, and they also were not really sure why, they thought that maybe if they drove out the evil spirits, that the evil spirits would take the British with them. And so they finished off the rest of their cattle in hopes that by killing their cattle and burning their crops, the evil spirits would leave and take the British. However, the results were famine and deaths of thousands from that famine, and the British were not driven out. So that was unfortunate. Then we have the wars in Sudan. This is led by Muhammad Ahmad. Here's how you spell that. Okay. He is an Islamic cleric who wants to basically restore the glory of Islam in the Sudan. He tries the political movement and kind of turns it into a religious movement. His army will take control of the capital, and the British will attack him and drive him out. So the biggest problem is that Ahmad dies, and shortly after his death, rival leaders are kind of competing about who's going to take over. This gives the British a chance to return and completely defeat them in 1898. Okay, yes, Wan Ying, yes. King Leopold would have been in the Congo. He eventually is going to be kicked out by his government, though. The parliament will kick him out for what he is doing to the people. All right, let's go on to 6.4. Topic 6.4 is global economic development, how raw materials are used. So basically, raw materials are needed by factories and increased food supplies for the big urban populations. So the profits of these raw materials are then used to buy finished goods. So let's look at the different raw materials you have. The first one is cotton. That is going to be coming from Egypt. It will come from the U.S., but not during the Civil War. They can't get it during the Civil War because of the blockade. And India as well. And it will be used to create textile products or fabrics. Then we have rubber. That is coming from Amazon Basin and the Congo. This is used for tires on bicycles, automobiles eventually, hoses, waterproof clothing, shoe soles, gaskets, and other items. And then we also have palm oil. That's coming from West Africa. That's used to oil the machines that are used in the factories. It also talked about in the reading that palm oil was once used in Africa for a currency, which I thought was interesting. That's how much the tribes there valued it. All right, the next thing you have is guano, which is spelled like this. And that comes from Peru and Chile, and it becomes a natural fertilizer for farmers. We also have cattle. That's another resource that's coming from Argentina and Uruguay. And the middle class will demand this. They really will enjoy eating cattle as a source of their protein. And then we have diamonds coming from Africa. That's mostly going towards jewelry. So that's your raw materials. All right, 6.5 talks about economic imperialism. This is where imperialized states and businesses within those states practice economic imperialism. This is primarily going to happen in Asia and Latin America. So let's talk about how Britain and France expand their influence through the Opium Wars. So we have Chinese goods. They're in high demand from the British, right? The British want the Chinese goods, but the Chinese don't really want the British goods. So that creates a trade imbalance. As a result, British kind of pay for those goods with silver. But the problem is their silver reserves are running low, so they need to find something else to trade with China. The East India Company starts to force India to grow more opium. That opium will make up for the low amount of silver that the British have because they're going to sell opium to the Chinese for silver. Then they use the silver to buy other Chinese goods that they want. Unfortunately, this drug is very addictive. It causes hallucinations and it can also help relieve pain. And so the Chinese really, really like it for those two reasons, but it's very addictive. And so the Chinese government doesn't like it because it's making people kind of lazy and not really like in tune with their culture. It's kind of starting to ruin the culture of China, or at least that's the opinion of the Chinese government, and it's also illegal in China. The first Opium War happens because the Chinese take a warehouse full of opium that's owned by the British, and the British, of course, are not happy about that, and it starts the first Opium War. The British will win this war where they sign the Treaty of Nanking. In this treaty, they force China to open ports, to give them Hong Kong, and to pay damages. Free trade is somewhat forced on China through this, and it also includes British opium, even though it's illegal in China. So war breaks out again because neither side is really happy with these terms of this arrangement. The French will join the British in the Second War. Europeans win. In that Second War, as a result, they forced the Chinese to open even more ports, allow Christian missionaries to move around the country, legalize opium, and the British take the Kowloon Peninsula. So they expand their influence by force, and they continue eroding away at the legitimacy of the Chinese government. That's the gist of what's happening with the Opium War. Eventually, that will lead to spheres of influence where more European countries, including Japan as well, even though that's not a European country, that would be Asian, including Japan, go in and they start carving up pieces of China that they can have economic control or sphere of influence over. Any questions about that? Because that's a lot of information. Okay. Okay, let's go on. So, how was the British support of construction of the Port of Buenos Aires an example of economic imperialism? All right, first of all, what is economic imperialism? Well, economic imperialism is when a foreign business invests and helps develop an area. The business develops, then it takes advantage usually of the natural resources. So the people that are in that area, the raw materials, the refined materials are often exploited by whatever business invested. They then serve their own economic needs by turning the colonies into export colonies. That means that they would produce goods for the colonial powers to sell for profit instead of domestic profit. So sometimes this is not a very good deal because even though the foreigners are investing and that economy is getting something out of it, they're definitely paying back with their raw materials. So in this case, the port of Buenos Aires was needed to improve import and export services, which will benefit the British economically. So that's why they're going to invest in it, because it benefits them. Okay. How was cotton grown in Egypt and South Asia used to Britain's economic advantage? So we talked about this a little bit when I was talking about cotton. The British were getting their cotton from America, but during the Civil War, they couldn't get it anymore. And so the British had to find it in other places. And in Egypt, they made the farmers grow more cotton so that they could get more of it. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to blow my nose real quick. This weather is just killing me. Hot, cold, hot, cold. All right, so how was palm oil produced in sub-Saharan Africa used to economic advantage? Basically, once again, it's used to oil the machines during the Industrial Revolution. Okay, we're at 6.6. Let's keep going. So causes of migration in an interconnected world. So we're looking at push and pull factors here. The first one we're going to look at is the Japanese agricultural workers in the Pacific. So one of the push factors Where is palm oil produced? Is that what you're asking? That would be in Africa. Okay, so push factors push people away from their land. So an example of that would be war. Pull factors pull them to a new land. So let's talk about push factors first. The first one for the Japanese is lack of job opportunities in Japan, as well as they want to acquire new land overseas. So the government is going to actually start to initiate people leaving and migrating from Japan so that they can acquire more area. So almost like imperializing, right? The Japanese are trying to get a little piece of the pie as well. That second part where they're wanting to acquire more land, that will be Japanese or government-led, Japanese government-led. Pull factors, one of the pull factors that they have is work on the sugar plantations in Hawaii. They also go to the U.S. to be educated, mostly the West Coast. The problem in the U.S., though, in 1907, there's this very high anti-immigrant sentiment throughout the United States. Even though everybody there was primarily immigrants at one time, they're starting to kind of be like, no, we don't want any more immigrants coming in. So in 1907, there was an agreement between the U.S. and the Japanese that the U.S. would restrict immigration and Japan wouldn't allow any more immigration to come to the U.S. However, it was never really ratified. And so it doesn't really take effect until the Immigration Act of 1924. That one limits immigrants coming into the U.S. And so it will limit Japanese coming in. But by that time, there were a lot already here. All right, and then we have the Lebanese merchants in America. I did not look that one up. I forgot to look that one up. But the push factors for them, I know one of them is a lack of job opportunities in their country. So a pull factor would be more job opportunities. There may be a couple more, though. I'll have to get back to that one. Okay, let's go to the Italian industrial workers in Argentina. Italians coming to Argentina, they are escaping low wages and poverty in Italy. All right. They're also sometimes leaving for political reasons and high levels of crime in Italy due to the mafia. In Argentina, some pull factors are that they have very pro-immigration policies. So the laws are really good and pro-immigration. They also have better wages in Argentina, and that's another reason that they're coming in. The British engineers and geologists going to South Asia and Africa, they have mostly pull factors, and the pull factors were to gain the knowledge from other colonial lands of different ideas. And what they would do basically is they would go and take their knowledge to the colonial lands and gain knowledge from the colonial lands and kind of mix them together. They're also, another pull factor is helping improve and collaborate on public works and private industry projects. So they're basically going to gain more experience in order to take it back to their home countries. There aren't a lot of push factors for them. You could maybe say one would be opportunity to travel and gain insight into what the rest of the world is doing. But for the most part, it's just pull factors for them. Okay, the Irish coming to the U.S. Push factors. They're trying to escape the Great Potato Famine. That happened from 1845 to 1849. So they're escaping that famine. It destroys the potato crop for 4 years. That's a lot of time. 3 million people left during that time. So 3 million people are pushed out and migrate other places. And one of the pull factors is job opportunities. They're basically looking for more opportunities for jobs. All right, Chinese to the U.S. and Southeast Asia. Push factors for them, escaping poverty and famine, escaping the disorder that comes from the rebellions, specifically the Taiping Rebellion. That's where the peasants will rise up against the dynasty. However, they are shut down with the help of the British and the French. The Europeans basically help shut that down. So you can say for their push factors, disorder in their country, as well as poverty and famine. And then a pull factor for them would definitely be job opportunities. They were pretty much responsible for building the Transcontinental Railroad in the U.S. So they are super connected with that. You'll learn more about that next year in American history. Are you excited? I bet you are. I know you are. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is economic systems. These are important to remember because on your AP test, they will often just kind of like lump these all together and talk about like an economic system or a labor system. And so it's important that you know the difference. Kevin, what do you mean? What about Bismarck? Let me know. Okay, so slavery, 1750 to 1900. This is when basically a forced migration and forced labor. Africans are forced through the triangular trade from Africa to the Americas and sometimes from Africa to the European countries. Africans are needed in America to work on plantations. They're also needed in the Caribbean and South America as well. And Europeans need them on the southern coast as well as elsewhere. So they're used kind of all over in those areas in order to cultivate and do agricultural work. They're going to cultivate cash crops, primarily cotton, rice, and tobacco. All right, then we have the Chinese indentured servants. The slave trade is abolished in 1806. So indentured servants kind of takes the place of slaves, right? Even when we talk about the Europeans going into Africa and using African natives to work for them, if they pay them, they're just paying them a small amount. It's not very much. So they're basically slaves as well, and their use is kind of replaced slavery. Indentured slave system is basically, indentured servants are basically replacing slavery as well. And we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, Chinese indentured servitude, this is a contract labor system and used to replace slavery. So that's what you need to put there. You also need to talk about that they migrate to the Caribbean, South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, as well as North America. So they're kind of going all over the place. Then we have Indian indentured servants. They are used mostly throughout the British Empire, and this indentured servants system is also used to replace slavery. They migrate to Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And last but not least, as far as economic systems go, we have convict labor. This is used because England has too many prisoners, and so they start sending them to penal colonies, specifically in Australia, and they get cheap labor from them in order to do public service jobs. And this was used as like disciplinary methods. It will eventually lead to Australia having a gold rush and eventually a mass migration to Australia. Okay, so now we have 6.7, the effects of migration. How does the migration of men out of their home societies impact the life of women? So it's important to remember that sometimes after the men leave, there will be someone else that is a male role model in that family, like say a grandfather or something, that will come and watch over that family. But sometimes the woman actually gains more autonomy and authority because sometimes she takes on the role of the male if there's no older male to come and watch over the family. If eventually they go and join their husbands, they might get more say, but they're never going to specifically be equal. Okay, there's not much equality during a husband and wife at this time. And then another thing that you can put down is that most of the time when the men come back, the women are going to continue their domestic role and most of the time not continue the outside role. Sometimes they will, but most of the time not. Also, sometimes men will send money home after they've migrated to help support their families. So that's a little information about the gender information. Okay, So we also have ethnic enclaves. We talked about this a little bit in class the other day, and this is basically clusters of ethnic groups that are living together in a foreign city. We see this when you talk about Chinatown or Little Italy. All right, those would be examples of ethnic enclaves. If you've never been down to Chinatown here in Houston, it's really fun. You should definitely check it out. I went down there and did some karaoke one time. It was super fun. All right, so let's talk about migrant people. Let's talk about the Chinese first. So their enclaves are mostly going to be in Southeast Asia, Caribbean, and North and South America. That's where their migrant enclaves will be. Let's talk about Southeast Asia first. This is where they're really going to thrive because in Southeast Asia, they're allowed to participate in commerce. They're going to manage opium farms for the British, as well as be in charge of some colonial government. So they'll be given a little bit of power by the British in Southeast Asia. And they will definitely control trade in this area in the 1800s. In America, they're responsible for building the railroads. They sometimes will also work in factories and do other things other than that, but primarily the Chinese who came over helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Transcontinental just means from one side to the other, right? Spanning the whole continent. In each area that they worked, they're going to leave their cultural stamp. Oftentimes, they will also marry locals, and so that will kind of embed their culture even more, and it will contribute to a very multicultural, diverse population wherever they are. Their food, their customs, all those things will kind of be integrated into those areas. All right, next up, we have Indians. They are going to primarily be in East and Southern Africa, the Caribbean, as well as Southeast Asia. Let's talk about Africa first. In Africa, they are indentured servants who will replace slaves. When they come, they bring their caste system and their Hindu traditions. However, the caste system will eventually go away. They do keep most of their Hindu traditions, though, while they're in Africa. Indians in South Africa, they do experience discrimination because remember, in South Africa, we have the segregation that's going to be called apartheid, where the whites and the blacks are separate. Indians are considered colored or with the black people, and so they are separated from the whites. Gandhi is someone we're going to talk about really soon. He actually gets his start as a lawyer in South Africa, and there's some reading that just came out. It's really, really interesting. Some historians have been doing some research about whether or not Gandhi was racist against black people, because in a lot of what he writes, he talks about Hindus and Indians having the same rights as the British, but he doesn't really support, at least in his writings, they're claiming that he doesn't support Africans having those same rights. So I need to do a little bit more research about that. I've just brushed the surface of what they're talking about, but it would definitely be an interesting topic to discuss because often when we think of Gandhi, we think of peace and him wanting independence and things like that. We don't think of him not wanting independence for every race, right? So it definitely would be interesting if that's true. Now, take it for a grain of salt. I have not completely researched it out, but the new book that is out claims that it is true based on some things that he's read. And it's super interesting because it just kind of shows you how history changes when new things come out and historians start asking more questions. So anyway, let's get back to this. Eventually, Gandhi will return to will return to India from Africa, and he will start the fight for independence in India. All right, we have Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, that's where indentured servants will replace a slavery system there. Under the old system, the entire family was put to work on the tea, coffee, and rubber plantations. As indentured servants, their lives will be less restricted than slaves' lives were restricted at those plantations. And then in the Caribbean, they're going to work on the sugar plantations. Keep in mind, all the places that they go, they kind of blend their culture, their food, their film, their music into the cultures that they're coming to. All right, let's look at the Irish. Irish are coming to North America, And before the American Revolution, most Irish are coming as indentured servants. However, after, they're going to come as immigrants, and they're mostly going to settle in the northern cities to work in the factories. They're mostly very poor. They're mostly Catholic by religion. And because they're working in these factories and kind of constructing the canal system as well, they're not really well liked by the other Americans that are already there. So there eventually be a very anti-immigrant sentiment towards them as well. Remember, they're fleeing from the potato famine. Single women are coming over and working as domestic servants, and they will definitely face discrimination. They're going to also spread their culture and their holidays like St. Paddy's Day. I was talking to a guy from Ireland a couple of months ago, and I asked him about St. Paddy's Day and how they celebrate it in Ireland, and he was like, we don't. He's like, that's pretty Americanized. So it's kind of interesting that Americans kind of took that holiday and ran with it, and the Irish are not like super big into it anymore. At least that's what he was saying. I don't know, maybe it's just parts of Ireland that don't celebrate it or don't celebrate it as much, but Americans definitely like it. Okay, then they also will have a strong hand in promoting labor unions. That will become important in the next chapter, and as well as spreading Catholicism. So those are some things about the Irish. Now we have the Italians. They're going to be coming to North and South America. Most that are going to South America will go to Argentina. Remember, Argentina gets a lot of investments from European countries, so it feels very reminiscent of Europe, at least to Europeans who are going there. And when they go there, they're going to become day laborers, farmers, and artisans in Argentina. The cost of living is very low, and they will also spread their culture throughout Argentina. Oh, we're getting close. We're almost done with chapter 6. So exciting. All right. So receiving societies did not always embrace immigrants coming in. We know this because of the anti-immigrant sentiments. One of those was the Chinese Exclusion Act. This is from 1882 to 1943 in the U.S. What is that? Well, it's basically a law that is going to prevent Chinese laborers from immigrating into the U.S. They don't want them to come. It's the first immigration law that excluded an entire ethnic group. And it's also going to not allow them to become citizens of the U.S. That's in 1882. Then we also have the White Australian policy. That's 1901 to 1970. That is going to take place in Britain and affect Australia. And it's basically Chinese immigration regulation and restriction where it limits the Chinese migration to Australia. It will be repealed or canceled in 1867. And at that time, resentment will grow because the Chinese worked less or worked for less than white people did. And so that's kind of when the Australians are really supporting this because they don't want competition from the Chinese people. Because this policy is going to forbid the Asians from even immigrating to Australia. So both of these you can kind of similarly compare to what's happening today in the U.S. with immigrants coming in. You hear a lot of this on the news. We don't want them taking our jobs. We don't want them, working for less. But the truth of the matter is there are several places in the United States, including Houston, that would not be able to survive without immigrants coming in and doing jobs that Americans don't want to do and don't want to do for that amount of money. I think that's the problem. Because it is true that most immigrants will work for less, and if they're coming in illegally, then they're going to be able to work for less because they need the money. They're desperate for that money. So it's kind of interesting because that discussion that was happening in the 1800s is still happening today in the U.S., and you'll hear about it in our upcoming presidential candidacy and debates. So does anybody have any last minute questions? That is chapter or unit 6, pretty much imperialism, effects of it, rebellions, state expansion. One quick thing that I want to tell you before you guys hop off of here, I was looking at some of the LEQ prompts today. Make sure that when you are asked about the global shift of power, that you reference that and you connect it with whatever you're talking about. I saw a lot of really good essays that talked about topics that definitely have to do with a global shift in power, but they never brought it back around and actually connected it with that. So that's super important to do in your LEQ. If it's asking for similarities and differences, make sure you're actually comparing within the paragraphs. I saw several essays that had, well, this is what was going on in Africa, this is what was going on in South Asia, but they never brought them together and compared them. You need to compare it in the same paragraph. So if it's a similarity, you're talking about both of them in the same paragraph and why they're a similarity. If it's a difference, you're talking about both of them in the same paragraph and why it's a difference. Also, before you hop off here, hit that like, thumbs up button. That'd be great. I appreciate it. It helps this channel out a lot. And if you are on TikTok, make sure you stop by my TikTok at Time Machine Teacher and start listening to the WAP word of the day. Every day I do a vocab word, and it's been helping my students a lot. So stop on by there and check that out. I also posted on Instagram at Time Machine Teacher if you don't have TikTok yet. All right, you are so welcome, Wen Ying. Definitely take this information that we've talked about, put it on some flashcards, and study it for Monday, and you'll do great. Remember, on Monday's test, there will be a lot of primary documents. Make sure you're looking at those primary documents and you're analyzing them. Pick out the questions that, or the answers that you know are not right away. And then you usually get it narrowed down to about 2 answers. And one is somewhat correct, but the other one is the better choice. So make sure that you're really looking and you're taking your time to figure out those answers. And I think you'll do great with the information that we've covered here as well. So thank you again for tuning in. Have an awesome day off tomorrow. I'm so excited to sleep in. I'm sure you guys are too. Although my sleeping in is about 7 o'clock because I can't sleep in much anymore, but we'll see how it goes. So anyway, if you have any last minute questions, put them in there and I will get back to you after I post this chat. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great night and an awesome weekend. I'll see you guys on Monday.